This is Mike Stax of Ugly Things Magazine and the Loons, and you're listening to Waterloo Underground.
Hey there, Waterloo Undergrounders. You're listening to a brand new episode of Waterloo Underground with Miriam and
Johnny.
Yeah, there he is. And today we've got a really cool episode going because we're going to be speaking with none other than Mike Stax. Oh, you know that name. Musician, author, publisher, editor, bon vivant, tastemaker, guy from across the pond. He's been with us, he's still with us, and he's ruling the planet. Say hey, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, it's a pleasure. And we just wanted to get started with everything. You know, Waterloo Underground, our big focus is on the Kinks reunion, which is inevitable. We know that. But we're dragging in all of the fanzine people who were such great supporters of the Kinks and of the music. And, of course, you're the Pretty Things aficionado and know that there's a Kinks relationship there. But I know you're a fan as well. And we want to know what these people are all about. People like you who went into a lifetime of music and writing and research and celebrating your heroes and our heroes. Where did you come from anyway, Mike? You've got a funny accent.
Well, like the Kinks, I'm from England. So I was born just north of London and moved around the country a little bit because my dad moved around with his job. And lived in England till I was 18 years old. Got out of high school, and I wrote a letter to a band in San Diego called the Crawdaddies. And they were on Vox Records, or Bomp Records. And I heard them on the radio, on John Peel's radio show in England. And I think they were actually doing a cover of I'm a Lover, Not a Fighter. Or it may have been Oh Baby Doll by Chuck Berry. But anyway, they did this great version, and it just sounded like a band from 1964 or 1965 from England. But John Peel explained that it was a band from San Diego, California, which just kind of blew my mind. Because
What year was that?
That was 1980. So
Wow.
There was nobody in 1980 that sounded like 1965, you know. Maybe the Flaming Groovies, you know, but that was about it. So anyway, I ended up writing a fan letter to the band, care of Greg Shaw at Bomp Records, and he forwarded it to them. And they ended up writing me a letter saying, you sound like a cool guy. And I'd mentioned that I played bass. I had a band at the time called the High Heel Sneakers doing the same kind of stuff. They said, you want to come to San Diego, play bass in our band? I thought, wow, okay. I didn't know what else I was going to do. I had sort of plans to maybe go to university, but it seemed like a good way to delay that. So
I'll say.
So I headed to San Diego, California as a teenager with, I think I had a bass guitar and a suitcase, and I think I had $200 to my name and pretty much been here ever since.
Wow. Well, let's backtrack a little bit to when you were still in England. What groups were you listening to then, and what really got you fired up about the mid-'60s stuff, about the beat groups and so on?
Well, I was born in 62, so, the 60s stuff I didn't really experience in real time. When I became aware of music, it was sort of in the early 70s,
Right.
Watching Top of the Pops and seeing bands like T-Rex and David Bowie and Slade and Sweet and things like that. And David Bowie was what I first fixated on. But as soon as I started buying records, I immediately started digging back into the past as well.
Did you have older siblings or?
No, I have one younger sister, but my dad has pretty decent music taste, and he had some Beatles albums, actually on a reel-to-reel tape. He had Rubber Soul and Help, so I used to listen to those. And then the radio would be playing stuff from the 60s, and I started gravitating towards the 60s stuff. It started with the Stones, the Brian Jones era Stones, and from there I got into the Pretty Things and the Kinks and the Yardbirds and all the usual suspects.
Right. So when you headed for the States and ended up in San Diego, how were you supporting yourself at that time? Did you just grab any job that you could and practicing a lot, or what was going on there? What was that scene like? Because that was really when things were really starting with Greg Shaw at the helm, right?
Yeah, I think I was pretty naive, and I sort of took the things that I was reading in fanzines, and Who Put the Bomb and the liner notes on the back of the Crawdaddies album, and kind of taking them to be sort of the truth. And they were a little bit of hyperbole involved. So I knew that the Crawdaddies were on Bomb Records, and they played shows, and were apparently quite popular. But of course, when I got to San Diego, I found that all the guys in the band were living with their parents, and and we didn't really make very much money from playing shows. So I just basically lived from hand to mouth, and so it was a struggle, and a lot of times I went hungry. I mean, literally, go to bed being hungry, but stuck it out, and it worked out in the end.
You must have been a pretty exotic creature when you landed in California too. Weren't they thrilled to have an English person out there?
Oh yeah, I mean, people couldn't understand what I was saying. It was, it was. Are you from Liverpool? I mean, it was still in 1980. People were still had a pretty limited view of what England was. They knew about the Beatles and Benny Hill. That was kind of England to them.
Yeah. Can you describe the scene there? Because, San Diego is not Los Angeles, and it's not San Francisco. It's its own scene. And you played a major role in developing that scene.
Yeah. I mean, it really began, with Ron Silver of the Crawdaddies, was sort of this guy who was just devoted to just the music of the mid-'60s. And he was very, very good at it. And he had so much talent that people sort of gravitated to him. And the Crawdaddies were the only thing going that was a pure, authentic 60s group. There were other bands like the Unknowns who were influenced by the 60s, but, the Crawdaddies were like the real deal, authentic. So it just seemed natural that other groups would spin off of that. In a sense, the Telltale Hearts was a spin-off of everything I'd learned in the previous 3 years playing with Ron and the Crawdaddies, but now wanting to assert my own individuality somewhat. And, as more kids started coming to the shows for us and the Crawdaddies, other bands started to form, like the Gravedigger Five and the Morlocks. Our shows were probably 60% female audience because you could dance. And then, of course, that where there's girls dancing, guys start coming too, and I think people that maybe before would have been part of a punk rock scene or some other genre of music. Remember how tribal music used to be? They started gravitating towards what, for better word, the garage scene, the 60s garage scene, because there were girls, the music was good, you could dance, you could meet people, and that's a very pure thing. The music is actually has some content. It's not just anger and noise. It's musical. It's very different. Los Angeles is only 100 miles away, but it's such a big city, and it's Hollywood, and it was always a very different vibe to it than San Diego. We're a little more innocent, I think.
Right.
A little less. And maybe a little less driven by ambition to be rock stars, Everyone in LA is sort of wanting to be famous because that's what the magnetic pull of that city is, right? It's, let's be a star. But in San Diego, you're just kind of, let's have fun.
What groups were you in? Like you went in, you were in the Crawdaddies. Like what was the pattern after that? Who did you go into after that? Did you play in other groups? Did you sit in with other groups?
After the Crawdaddies, I formed my own band, and that was the Telltale Hearts, and that was in 1983.
Great group.
Yeah. Crawdaddies, I was just the bass player, and I was kind of just learning to play, and it was more of a straight ahead R&B blues group, It was like a 1964 Rolling Stones kind of deal. And then the Telltale Hearts was more like, let's start writing our own songs. And it was more '66 American garage, and also we were very influenced by the Dutch beat groups of the '60s, and of course the Pretty Things were like #1 influence on everything we did.
When you were playing in the group and stuff like that, what was really the start of you writing? I mean, were you writing for Bomp at that time, or did you do a start there, or did you just come up with this idea? Because, you know, looking at those earliest issues that were just pretty much like offset or Xerox kind of copies with the little staples on the side and stuff like that, I don't think you imagined that you were going to spend your life publishing this magazine, and the way that it grew into a quarterly, and a huge quarterly at that.
Well, it was, you know, it's a very gradual process. I mean, even back in England, I used to, you know, read fanzines all the time. I was always a fanzine fan. And then when it came to America, more so. And Kicks was one of my favorites. It was a big inspiration on me. A magazine out of Scotland called Bambalam.
Right.
Hog, that was a big one. And Gorilla Beat out of Germany. And of course, what Greg was doing with Who Put the Bomb. And I just wanted to write about the kind of music that I loved, the music from the '60s, the lesser known bands. So I thought it would be fun to put together a fanzine with a couple of my friends. So that's what I did. And then, you know how it is, but from there, you start getting into contact with people from other parts of the country and other parts of the world, and it kind of snowballs from there. And I really enjoyed doing it. I enjoyed the interaction with other music fans, you know, and so I just kept going.
Once it got rolling, you started to contact some of these older groups and people that you had liked to try to update people on what they've been up to and talk to them about their old music. Do you have any good stories about anybody particular that you found?
Yeah, that was, it started with the second issue, when I realized, you know, I should reach out and try to contact some of these bands, try to find some of these guys from the, you know, '60s garage bands. And the first person that I contacted was Sean Bonnewell from the Music Machine. And he said, come on up and we can do an interview. So I drove up to an apartment in the San Fernando Valley, I believe it was, and spent an afternoon talking to Sean Bonnewell, who seemed like this, you know, long-haired beard, like sort of old wise man of the... And I realize now that he was probably about 43 or something.
Yeah, right.
But he seemed like this really old wise guy, and he was playing me unreleased Music Machine songs and showing me all these photographs and telling me all these stories. And I really sort of fell in love with the idea of championing these people and telling their stories, rather than interview people that have been interviewed many times before. You know, I've done that too. They tend to sort of default to the answers that they've given before. These stories that they've told them over and over again, and they kind of smooth them shiny and nice with the retelling. But it's so much more exciting to talk to somebody who's never talked about those things before. And I think you get a more pure account of what happened. You know, their memories are less rose-colored, maybe. And it's just more interesting. You know, I'm always seeing it through a fan's eye view, whereas I want to read stories I haven't read before. I want to know things about the band that I haven't read in other books and other fanzines. So that's always what I'm aiming for.
And they were probably pretty excited to talk to you after obscurity for 20 years or so, right?
Yeah, it's strange, and I'm sure Miriam has experienced this many times too. A lot of times when you first contact them, they're very suspicious. You know, if you cold call a guy and you want to talk to him about
collection agents
band from when he was 18 years old, they're kind of like, is this a crank call? You know, is this, what do you want from me? You know, or they're suspicious. And then when you talk to them for a bit and they realize, wow, you really do know my music, and you really are sincere about your love of my music, then they really open up to you. And I think they really do enjoy that. They really do like that validation for what they did actually did have some value, you know. You know, they put away those records and those scrapbooks, you know, in the cupboards, and maybe their kids know a little bit about it, but nobody really cares about it anymore in their circle of acquaintances.
Right.
You know,
right.
they're a plumber now, or a teacher, or a lawyer, or whatever they are. But to talk about the stuff they did for maybe just a few years when they were teenagers, that really gets them excited, because there is some pride there, you know, and some of them, I think, have a sense that maybe they failed, you know, especially some of the bands that they actually did get signed to a record label and maybe did become popular in their town or even in their country for a short while. And then for some reason, it all went wrong. And there's some bitterness, there's some feelings of failure. And when you let them know, no, people still listen to your records, you know, that what you did really does matter. That's a huge validation for them.
Yeah, you're bringing in a lot of people who, new people all the time, right? I mean, who don't know something, or they pick it up and they read a story and then they're drawn in. So it's fantastic. And the same with your music. Now, this past year has been unbelievably terrible for all concerned, every human being on this planet. How has that affected you with the music and with the magazine and with all of the research that you do and people that you deal with? How has it been?
Well, I mean, it's changed everything, really. As far as doing the magazine, I like to get out there and go do interviews in person. You know, you always get better results that way. You can get more of a connection with the person you're interviewing and, you know, get access to their archives and things like that. So that's not been possible. I've had to do everything by phone. So I've just had to adapt. On the other hand, not being able to go out, because we've been very strict about that, and not being able to play any shows, I have more time. I have more time, quiet time to reflect. And as someone who wants to write, you know, that's what you need as a writer. You know, you need to be alone in your head. You need to have quiet time where you can write or research and do all the things you need to do. So in that way, it's been quite productive. You know, it's been, that's been good. But yeah, I mean, it's all very worrying. And of course, we've lost so many great people this year. And, you know, of course, Phil May passed away in May, and that was, you know, my biggest hero and also a good friend. So that was, you know, that was just a terrible loss. And then a reminder that, you know, what we do with the magazine and what you do with Norton and Kicks again, you know, has a time. The time is running out on getting the first-hand accounts.
That's true.
Of these stories and this music. I mean, some of these guys may be around for another 10 or 20 years, but many of them are dying off, sadly.
Yeah.
And those who aren't, their memories are fading. And also, I think newer generations of people are maybe less interested in that music. They're interested in what has come since, to some extent. They now have some kind of, you know, some people have nostalgia for the 80s and the 90s, you know?
Yeah.
You know, so, that feeling that not that time is running out, but that what we do has an importance, that it's that we must, there's some urgency to getting some of these stories down while they're, you know, while the people are still alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do a great job with that. Thank you very much for doing everything that you do.
I just plan on continuing to do what I do. I want to continue to make music and write songs. I want to continue to publish the magazine and write stories. I want to write more books. I want to tell more stories. That's the only thing I know how to do.
How much of that old influence still stays with you when you write today?
Well, yeah, the old influence is always there. And I think, but the whole idea is to try to not be a historical reenactment of something,
right?
But rather to create something new that reflects your own personality. And, you know, with the Loons, you know, we've been together with pretty much the same lineup for over 20 years. So we have a real chemistry of the way we write together and play together. And I think in the last couple of years, you know, we assimilated the influences of things like the Pretty Things in Love and the Yardbirds and made something that was our own, while still staying true to the spirit of that and still, you know, using the old analog recording techniques and the vintage gear and all the stuff that we love, but but making something that we felt was expressed, what our lives were about, and about, how we wanted to sound. And the idea was to try to make records as good as your heroes rather than copy your heroes. So that's what we try to do. And of course, you never get there, but you've got to always be reaching for something better rather than trying to dumb yourself down, to play worse than you can. You're always trying to play the best you can. That's where I see bands like the Kinks and the Who, the Pretty Things, making their best music was when they were aspiring to do something that was maybe a little bit out of their reach, and I think that came together quite nicely on that song Blue Ether.
So I'm really curious about the connecting of your dots. We all have our histories with bands and how this band led to another band, led to another band, and led to another band. So, eventually you want to find out how you got to the Kinks. I know you said the Stones, the early Stones, which I'm a huge Brian Jones fan too. So what about Brian Jones and that era led you to other groups?
Yeah, I think as soon as I had all the Rolling Stones records, up to Beggar's Banquet in my collection, I just kind of, what's next, I know for me, one of the things that helped me join the dots on some of that was actually David Bowie put out the Pinups album when I was like 11 years old or something, right? Or 12 years old.
73.
And it had Where Have All the Good Times Gone by the Kinks. And I loved that song. So I went out and found the Kinks version, which I liked even more. And of course, that album had two Pretty Things songs on it, Rosalind and Don't Bring Me Down. And I was aware of the Pretty Things, but I think that kind of cemented the fact that, Bowie endorsed them. For a kid growing up in England, when you're 13 years old, David Bowie let me do a lot of things, that may not have been cool to say in the garage age, but that's when I thought back on it later, because of Bowie, I heard about Lou Reed and immediately discovered the Velvet Underground when I was 13 years old.
Yeah, he was very generous with his own fandom, of the groups that he admired. He really gave them the props where maybe other groups just wanted to talk about themselves as though they invented everything, but he did. He did really talk about his other influences.
And his taste was so right on, whether it was, the Velvet Underground and the Kinks and the Pretty Things, or, Iggy and the Stooges,
Yeah.
So I think he got a lot of us on the right track right away, because, once you hear Raw Power and White Light, White Heat, you're not going to bother with what they now call yacht rock.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's, you have, your tastes have become somewhat refined, and that was a pretty fast way to get there.
Yeah. I've never read anybody say that or heard anybody really say that about Pinups, that was like that really was like an important record, for, I suppose for Bowie fans, it was just like, oh, he's doing a covers album, when they want to get original material, but it really was kind of a record that really pointed out his influences, and we went and listened to them as well, So
it was very kind of generous of him to sort of just give us a map.
Lou Reed did the same thing with Coney Island Baby, I mean, with like naming the songs after, after doo-wop songs and so on. It's like, what's going on? It's like, is that the same thing? And you understand their influences. You want to be cool like them. So you end up diving into this big vat of great music that you didn't realize before. And that's a gift.
It's funny when you think, I think Pinups was 1974, and that music that he was covering was only...
It's 73.
73,
right? So it was, the music was less than 10 years old.
Yeah, but he also put his own spin on the songs, though. There weren't exact covers. I mean, they were very different. I mean, See Emily Play, it's a much different version. So
yeah, you're right.
Just cover it. He did it in his own way. And, we're sort of close in age, you and me, Mike. So it's a different perspective, I think, because we weren't there when the stuff was released. And, you know, we talked to a lot of people that were like of age, you know, 13 when the Beatles came out, things like that. So obviously, you know, you hear those stories, but for people who are not around, it's interesting to hear how they got back to the 60s. And Pin Up was one of the records for me as well, because I'm a very big Syd Barrett fan. So that kind of led me there too.
Yeah. That was probably where I first heard about Syd Barrett, though. There was a Pink Floyd album called Relics that came out in the mid-70s that I picked up because I wasn't a fan of Pink Floyd, but a friend of mine had that album, and it had Arnold Layne and Bike and See Emily Play, and yeah, that I became a fan of them as well. Syd Barrett specifically.
Yeah.
Yep.
I started exploring more of the 60s bands, and you know, right away my favorites were the Pretty Things and the Yardbirds and the Who and the Kinks. The Kinks, you realize that they have so many great songs, and some of them that you would hear on the radio, and you know, I'm sure almost everybody on the show, most of the episodes that I've listened to, singles out You Really Got Me as being like one of the records that really blew their mind, and it was the same for me. I mean, You Really Got Me is what, you know, I would consider that one of the perfect records. The Kinks made a few perfect records, and that certainly is one of them. And,
it's just the shock of those solos, like where they come from. It's like, whoa!
and one of the greatest intros, you know, those first 10 seconds of that record, right away, you stop what you're doing and like, wow.
Yeah.
You know, that's how guitars should sound, you know. So that's a huge one for me. I know another record that I really loved the first time I heard it. It really affected me was Dead End Street, because it really, in that little, you know, 2.5 minute record, it's like an entire movie. You know, it's a whole scenario. And you know, I grew up watching, you know, those English sort of kitchen sink movies like Billy Liar and Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner and Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and reading those books by Keith Waterhouse and Alan Sillitoe. And it was like one of those, but in a form of a song, you know, what are we living for? A 2-room apartment on the 2nd floor. You know, that's, you know, it's just so beautiful and so cinematic. I mean, nobody else writes songs like that. I mean, Ray Davies is just an absolute genius in that way.
And it just occurred to me that you, having grown up in England, all of that it's familiar to you. But what was exotic to us, like not being from England and having these British groups come in and using these words like maisonette and stuff like this. What the heck is that? You know, but it's so exotic, and there's there was that allure of the whole English thing that really struck the American audience.
Now, were you into the Pretty Things before the Kinks? What was it like finding out that they did one of the Kinks songs?
Yeah, House in the Country.
I think I really couldn't discern whether I got into the Kinks or the Pretty Things first. I mean, I think I was aware of the Kinks, you know, through Ape Man, Lola, and songs on the radio. You didn't really have the Pretty Things. But I became a big Pretty Things fan before I started really becoming a huge Kinks fan, I think. And so I think I probably heard the Pretty Things version of House in the Country before I heard the Kinks version.
Right.
And I do have to say that I think I prefer the Pretty Things version. I think only because it feels like a more complete record. You know, they gave it a production for a single, you know. Whereas the Kinks, it sounded like they tossed it off as an album track, and they didn't put as much thought into it as they did for their singles. I mean, you see that with the Kinks. Their singles are really, I think that was maybe partly Shel Talmy knew which songs were going to be the single, and they put a lot of work into making those songs sound good. Whereas the album, a lot of the stuff sounds like first or second takes. Not that there's anything wrong with it, you know, that works too.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I would say I prefer the Pretty Things version of House in the Country. But, you know, I know I've talked to Phil May and Dick Taylor about it, and neither of them particularly cares for it. So I don't know why. I think they felt a little bit like not that it was beneath them, but like the Kinks were their contemporaries, so
were they
having
coaxed
to
into
record
doing
one
it?
of their songs was, felt a little wrong to them or something.
Was it brought to them by a producer, or were they coaxed into it?
I think the record label wanted a hit single, and the producer suggested they do this Kinks song, and they went along with it. They didn't really have much to bargain with. They hadn't had a record on the charts for almost 2 years by that point. So they just went with the program, I think.
It's an odd choice because it's a different record label as well.
Yeah, I don't think that mattered. Maybe somebody was getting a kickback from the publisher, but I think they just were looking to get them a hit single.
The Pretties also were so much more experimental as time went on. I mean, they, not to say that it's anything negative against the Kinks, because the Kinks stayed really in that kind of storyline kind of record world, where the Pretty Things went off into those, those wild ass psychedelic situations that we also love, but it didn't seem that the Kinks went along that route, it didn't go into that realm anywhere near as much as the Pretties did.
I love that about the Kinks, actually, is that they kind of, they were like the one...
reining it in, yeah.
The one band that did not go psychedelic for whatever reason, I mean, I'm sure one reason is probably Ray probably never took LSD, Ray was, a pint of beer down the pub and a cup of tea kind of a guy, I think,
Yeah.
Whereas I think the Pretty Things dove straight into the world of LSD, and we're also listening to American music. They were listening to the Byrds and Love and the West Coast bands. I don't think that interested Ray Davies at all. I think he just became more sort of quintessentially English. I think you've probably seen that newspaper article where they're comparing Ray to Al Bowley, the sort of big band crooner singer from the 30s and 40s in England, who I love. And he is a lot like Ray Davies, but they were saying this in a disparaging way because, groups were supposed to be taking music into the future, like the Who and the Yardbirds and the Pretty Things were doing, and the Beatles, obviously. Yeah. And Ray was sort of bringing nostalgia for, older times, like with the Village Green Preservation Society.
Yeah.
And things like that. But I mentioned, Where Have All the Good Times Gone, which I first heard the David Bowie version, but the Kinks version is really the one, and that's another of my favorites because, again, there's Ray already feeling nostalgic, at the age of, what was he, 22 then or something like that. And he's always, where have all the good times gone, where things were simpler and we hadn't lost our way, and I love that about Ray,
Yeah, he really was writing like from the future about being an older person, and he's always written that way, and music seems really appropriate to us now, rather than it was when we were younger, teenagers or whatnot. Now you listen to it as a let's just say someone older and it seems to apply even more, so it's very universal and eternal. That's what rock and roll is. It's a great form of music, and we love it.
Yes, and we love the Kinks.
We do love the Kinks.
The element of sentimentality, he just does it so well without ever being corny, because it's just very understated, but the little details in the song just really bring it home, and everyone can relate to it, even though, as you say, it's very English and there's a lot of English references, but the feelings that he's talking about, anybody from any country can relate to those things.
But what about Dave's music?
In fact, one of my earliest Kinks memories involves, I believe, a Marble Arch album, and I was very young, and they used to have them on racks in the supermarket or the drugstore. Wow. And there was one of the ones where there's a picture of the Kinks on TV, and Dave is in his full dandy glory, in an Edwardian jacket, and he has the super center parted hair. And I remember, I was really young, 6 or 7 years old, and I remember saying to my mom, why does that man have a lady's hair? And But it really stuck with me. I thought it was very, very cool. And I think ever since then, I kind of, as soon as I could, I grew my hair like a lady, you know?
Well, the ladies love that look, you know, so it works, that's for sure.
I feel like many of our guests have the Dave hair envy going on. At a very young age, too.
Yeah. Well, you can see Dave was a guy that he didn't care what people thought. He was just going to be as cool and weird as he wanted to be, and it was working for him, you know. And he's still kind of that way. He still has that attitude. I love Dave Davies. He's just, what an incredible person he is. Oh well, I mean, some of Dave's songs are some of the best because they're like a little eccentric. They're very Dave, you know, and you know, stuff like Susanna's Still Alive, you know, and then, you know, when I read his autobiography about the backstory behind that song and the girl that he loved and they were forbidden to see each other.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Yeah,
once I knew that song became infinitely more powerful and resonated with me way more, you know, and that brings me back to why I like writing these stories about these bands is when you get the backstories on this music, it makes you're able to appreciate the music in a new way, I think, you know.
Yeah.
I always got that from reading Kicks, you know, like, you know, sometimes you'd be writing about some records I knew about already, but once you put your perspective on them and, you know, told the stories behind them, they became so much better, you know, and you know, I think we all like that as music fans, you know, to have those things illuminated for us.
Yeah. And I think rock and roll really did that, is like humanized all of the individuals who were the musicians and who were writing and making these records as teenagers. Before that, it was like this scripted kind of an idea of who the performers were and who these pop stars were and stuff like that. You know, suddenly warts and all, you know, it's like the wartier that you were, the more we loved them, you know, we saw the beauty in the warts, you know.
Yeah,
it's a
you're
good
right,
name for a group. I'm sure there was one called the Warts. but really, it's the failures and the shortcomings that make rock and roll a great thing as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, in the beginning, a lot of the rock and roll music was sort of producers and managers trying to create something that they thought teenagers would like.
Right.
But at some point, the young people seized control of it themselves and started writing their own music. And they expressed their own feelings and their own emotions. And that's when it really took off for us, for all of us, you know, and that's why we still relate to it.
Absolutely. What about that Kinks reunion? At what point did you start believing in a Kinks reunion? Long time ago, right? Be honest now.
Well, no, I mean, I saw they were in the British newspapers just a few days ago. Did you see that?
Yeah, sure did.
Dilapidated followers of fashion.
Everybody was.
I thought they looked pretty smart in their nice overcoat.
I thought so too. Yeah. I thought so too. You know, and you know, I know what they were discussing. They were discussing the reunion, of course. You know,
very intensely, yes, with a can of lager in the hand.
yeah, and I understand that Dave was giving Ray a Jane County T-shirt. So I thought that, there must be something, what's going on? So we got to get that story from Jane. Like what's happening there? You know, very interesting right at the time that the whole Lola celebration's going on. Tell us a little bit about your partner in crime. You happen to meet the most wonderful woman in the world, Anya, and you started a life and you've got a great son. You know, tell us about how that happened. And she's such a vital part of your life. It's really the pair of you working together on the magazine, the group, everything.
Yeah, I mean, we met through the music scene, through the 60s music scene. Anya's from Germany, but she moved to London to be a part of the music scene there. You know, they had a really good 60s garage scene there. So she moved there and she was making 60s fashion, 60s clothes at Diabolic, which, you know, her friend Babs ran in London. Babsotica, rather, is the store. Her band was the Diabolics. And I think she wrote me about taking out an ad in the magazine, and we started corresponding. Back then, you know, I was always writing letters to people all over the world and trading tapes, trading records, trading information. And we had a friendship for many years, just based on music. I love music. And when her band, the Diabolics, came, wanted to tour America, we helped them set up some shows on the West Coast. You know, and they crashed at our house, and you know, when I'd go to London, you know, we'd spend time, and eventually it ended up, you know, we ended up becoming involved romantically, and she moved here in 1999, and we got married in 2000.
That's fantastic.
We've been married for 20 years.
So she's responsible for those colorful covers on the magazine, and that really sets the trend for each one.
And of course she joined, you know, by then I had the Loons, and she joined, became the bass player, and has been a part of the band ever since. So we play music together, we work on the magazine together, and you know, we do everything together.
All hail Mike Stax of Ugly Things. And I'm dead serious about that. But it's been a pleasure having you on, Mike, and I wish that you have all the good fortune over there and deal with all of this stuff for the next maybe just a couple of months of being stagnant, not being able to get out there with your music. I know that you're working hard and really writing and publishing and being yourself over there, and I know that it's a tough thing, but please give our best to Anya and Philip and all your pals and friends and all of the people out there on the West Coast who make this rock and roll scene such a wonderful thing. But thank you for what you do, and thanks for being a Kinks fan as well. It's a pleasure having you on.
All you do and all you have done over the years, you and Billy, and that, you know, you've been a huge inspiration on what I do. And, you know, we'll get through this next difficult period, and we can't wait to see everybody again in person. I've seen a lot of Zoom screens this last year. And while that's been a lifesaver, a lifeline in some ways, you know, I'm looking forward to seeing some people in person again.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Getting out in front of an audience again, and, you know, just going out and breathing fresh air again.
Yep. And it'll happen. You know, so let's just hope that it's soon. Mike, thank you so much. We'll see you next year.
Yes, it's on the other side of this.
Thanks for everything, Mike.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Johnny.